I understand most of you are my kin, and I'm happy to have you with me to celebrate my 290th birthday. And there's some disagreement about the date of my birth. I and Rebecca agrees with me that I was born in 1820, October 22, 1734, and that's called the old style calendar. About halfway through my life, the colonies changed to the new style calendar.
Turn that off.
And so thank you for being here on my birthday. I think we have a funny sound here. Can you hear me okay?
Okay. Turn off all the mics.
I'll continue. I'm not sure what that sound was. There are many myths that have been told about me during my lifetime, and one of the common ones is, what did I wear on my head? And many have said and think that this is what I would wear. But it's frequently told and repeated that I'd never wear one of these things on my head. The problem with it is that as a hunter, it wouldn't keep the sun off my head and the rain off of me. And so I frequently wore what many refer to as a Quaker or long hunter hat. I'm not going to leave this on during my presentation because Rebecca frequently gets upset with me wearing a hat in the house, so I've taken it off. I mentioned I was born in 1734, born in Pennsylvania, to parents Squire and Sarah Morgan, who were Quakers. And I was raised as a Quaker and lived in Pennsylvania, where I learned to hunt as a child. And the Quakers educated their children well, even the daughters. However, my father's frequently quoted as saying that let the girls do the learning and let Daniel do the hunting. So I spent a lot of time hunting rather than spending time in school. Although I did learn to read and write and was taught by my older brother Samuel's wife, Sarah, to read and write. So I could read and write. And as I grew older and when I was living on the Clinch River in 1773 to 1775, my future son-in-law, Hayes, also taught me to write even better and even taught me surveying. So I was better educated than most of you might believe I was. At the age of 16, or about the age of 16, my parents, my father, I won't go into all the details about what happened with the Quaker meeting and how my mother continued to be a Quaker, but my father ceased to be one. And so for that reason, one of the reasons, but also to find cheaper and better land, my father made a decision to move to the colony of North Carolina in the backcountry there. And we moved in 1750, and we moved along what is still known and what was known as the Yadkin River in an area known as the Forks of the Yadkin, and the settlements in that area were known as the Bryan settlements, named after my future wife, Rebecca Bryan's grandfather, Morgan Bryan. We first settled on the east side of the Yadkin at an area that's now known as Boone Cave Park, while my father surveyed and secured title on two 640-acre tracts in what is today known as Davie County, but at the time it was in the Bryan settlement. And as a young man, I continued to hunt in that area. I also was a member of the militia because every man ages 16 to 60 was required by the colonial government to be a member of the militia, and we trained periodically. And there were times when there were, especially Indian raids, where we were called out to defend the settlements. In 1754, I actually saw my first military action when the French and Indian War erupted, and I was a teamster or a wagoner with General Braddock's troops, and even George Washington was serving under him as a colonel at the time. One of the significant things that happened at that time is I met another wagoner whose name was John Finley, and I'll mention a little more about him because he became an important person in my life. But at Braddock's march to and up into Pennsylvania, we were to fight the French, and the troops, they were British troops, and they were ambushed on both sides by both the French and the Indians. And I was in a wagon toward the back of the troops. And when I saw the troops running to the back, I knew that there was a massacre. And so all the wagoners, including myself, cut our reins from our wagons, got on our horses, and fled this battle. General Braddock died, and it became known as Braddock's defeat. I went home back home to the Bryan settlements, and there I met a young woman by the name of Rebecca Bryan, and I met her at a wedding of my younger sister Mary and William Bryan, who was Rebecca's uncle. William Bryan and I became close friends. But when I met Rebecca, I knew I had to marry her. So in 1754, we married in the Bryan settlements. We initially settled in the front yard of my family's property along an area referred to as Dutchman's Creek, and then settled on our own land at Sugar Tree Creek. And my older brother Israel had recently died of consumption. And so Rebecca and I took in his two sons, Jesse and Jonathan, to live with us. And they continued to live with us from that time until we left for Kentucky in 1775. They remained behind in Kentucky, but were very close to us and treated as our own sons. Rebecca and I began having our children at Sugar Tree Creek, and our first 5 children were born there, with the exception of one, which was Susanna Boone, who was born up in Virginia because the Cherokee Wars erupted at the end of the French and Indian War, and many of the settlers fled from the forks of the Yadkin to other places for protection. I took Rebecca and the children, the family, up into Virginia, but then returned to North Carolina to fight as a member of the militia, and even fought until 1761, where there was a treaty with the Cherokee at the Long Island of the Holston. And of course, I was going back and forth to Virginia, but while I was at the Long Island of the Holston, which is in an area of what you would call Kingsport, Tennessee today, I joined a few of my fellow hunters, and we headed west to hunt what is now eastern Tennessee. And then I returned to Virginia, brought Rebecca and the family back to the forks of the Yadkin. We settled in. I bought one 640-acre tract of my father's property, and Squire Jr., my younger brother, was given the other tract that was Dutchman's Creek. And at Dutchman's Creek, my mother and father continued to live there, as well as Squire Jr. and his wife, Jane Van Cleve. And they lived there on that property until they migrated into Kentucky with me in 1775. My father died in 1764, and after he was buried at Joppa Cemetery, my brother Squire and I and 2 other companions headed south to Florida. And we made a long trek from North Carolina down into Florida because the British were selling land to settlers to get them to settle northern Florida. And we hunted there, and the hunting was bad, and the swamps were bad. And we went from St. Augustine, and we waded through the swamps, and at times we got lost and went to Pensacola. And in Pensacola, I bought a lot. So I bought a piece of land in Pensacola and thought I'd be settling in Florida, and returned home and made it home by Christmas Day, because when I was gone, it was always important to Rebecca that I get home by Christmas. So on Christmas Day, I returned, we celebrated, we partied. I told Rebecca that I bought land in Florida, and she said, "There's no way I'm leaving my Bryan family. We're not going to Florida." And so we didn't. So the following year after I returned, we moved from the forks of the Yadkin up to the upper Yadkin in North Carolina. And many say it was to find better hunting, but it was also to get away from what was becoming the regulator movement and the beginning of what would become the American Revolution in North Carolina. So we found more peace, but we also found better hunting up into western part of North Carolina. And from there, we would also go into Tennessee. And this was around 1767. And we were settled in what is along Beaver Creek in what today is known as Wilkes County. And actually, most of my family was around me. Mary Boone, Bryan, and William stayed back in the forks of the Yadkin, along the Yadkin, but my brother George and Edward and Squire and John Stewart with Hannah Boone, my younger daughter, we all moved up the Yadkin. And when John Finley came along, I hadn't seen him since the war and Braddock's defeat, but he found me along the upper Yadkin, and he stayed with us for the winter. And I was always curious and wanting to find a new land that I knew was called Kaintuck, because I knew of new lands and also better hunting where there weren't many Indians settled there. And so John Finley said he knew the way. He'd been there. He'd been to an area where there were settlements in what is Indian settlements and Shawnee settlements in what is now Clark County, Kentucky. So we made our plans, we gathered our supplies, and in May of 1767, we left the upper Yadkin and we made our way over the mountains. We followed what today and what was known as Wilderness Road, went west through southwestern Virginia, and Finley guided us through, for the first time, the Cumberland Gap. We spent time, once we got through the Cumberland Gap, exploring a land known as Kaintuck. And for a while, we saw no Shawnee, no Indians at all. And hunting was good. And Finley showed me around and even took me to the Indian settlement up in where is now Clark County, Kentucky, to show where he used to trade with the Indians, but they were no longer there. But the good times did not last. The Shawnee did find us. We ended up with multiple encounters during our explorations there. I lost track of John Stewart, who was my closest companion and hunting companion and Hannah Boone's husband. I continued to stay. Squire Boone, my brother, would come and go from the upper Yadkin into Kentucky back and forth and bring me supplies, and he'd take the hides back and he'd go back and forth. And I decided to stay in Kentucky for 2 full years from 1769 to 1771. Squire finally found me alone, brought me supplies, and he and I in 1771 hunted further, decided after being, we would say robbed, but the Shawnee would say they just took back what was there, which was all the hides we had. We continued hunting, but then went down into Tennessee, and from Tennessee, we went back to our home along the upper Yadkin. And I made it in 1771 my plan that we would live in the beautiful place that we called Kaintuck. So on our way, during our plans, it took us until 1773 to finally gather 40 people that were Boones and Bryans and others that knew us. And in 1773, we made our plans and we were ready to go into Kentucky and cross the mountains of North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. And we were headed toward the Cumberland Gap when we were ambushed one night. And my son and others were ambushed behind us and killed by Indians. And so our progress into Kentucky stopped. I found that my oldest son, James, was brutally murdered. So were two sons of Colonel Russell's. We buried the dead. I tried to convince people to move on to Kentucky, but nobody wanted to go. They were afraid to go. So the Bryans and many of the Boones returned to their homes. I had sold my home when I lived in what is now Wilkes County. So Rebecca and I and family settled along the Clinch River. And in 1774, while there, Lord Dunmore's War broke out. I was promoted to captain. I was given command of 3 forts, and the war was a short one. The Shawnees sued for peace. So by 1775, I was working with Judge Henderson for plans to move into Kentucky again. And in 1775, in March, Henderson and his Transylvania company signed a treaty with the Cherokee so that he could claim and establish the 14th colony in what is now Kentucky and Tennessee. And when he signed the treaty, or before he signed the treaty, I gathered up 30 axemen. But 2 women went with us. My daughter, Susanna, had recently married William Hayes, and he was one of the axemen, and she came along as a cook. And then one of the men's had a female slave that came along with us, and she was one of the cooks. So once the treaty was signed, we met at the Long Island of Holston and quickly made our way through the Cumberland Gap and up into Kentucky, and things looked like they were going well until we got to an area where we were again attacked by Shawnee. Man by Twitty was killed, his slave was killed. Some others were wounded. So we had to stay for a couple of weeks at that point that we named Twitty's Fort. And you can still find a marker today where that happened. Once we were sure we were safe, we moved north and headed to a place I had explored before during my previous time in Kentucky, and settled in an area along the Kentucky River and began to build and establish what my men named Boone's Fort, until Colonel Henderson or Judge Henderson could finally catch up with us. And he said, "You're building in too low of a place, men. Build on higher ground." So we started building the cabins that would become Fort Boonesboro. I'm going to tell you a little more of my life, but I also was told that 30 minutes would be about all the time I should take. And I was going to try to tell 86 years of my life, or almost 86 years of my life, in about 30 minutes. So I'll tell you a little more of my life, and then we may have to say that the story is to be continued. There are many, I mentioned 1775, and then at that date, we didn't know in May of 1775 that the colonists in New England had started a war with Great Britain, the most powerful army in the world. And the news finally got to us. Also, the Virginia governor and the North Carolina governor avoided Judge Henderson's claim to his colony of Transylvania. So we became a part of the colony of Virginia. And all of those who were members of the militia, including me, were now fighting for the colony of Virginia or the state of Virginia as militiamen. I served during the Revolution initially as a captain, served in a number of battles, the Siege of Boonesboro, the Siege of Bryan Station, the Battle of Blue Licks, Battle of Piqua, the invasion of the Ohio Territory by George Rogers Clark, and even more. I also served in the Virginia legislature for 3 terms, the first of which was in 1781. And at that time, I was in Virginia. And in 1781, the capital was in Richmond as designated by Governor Jefferson, but because we were warned that the Lord Cornwallis and Colonel Tarleton were invading Virginia and were ordered to take all members of the Virginia legislature and the governor, and if they were caught, they were to be hung. Fortunately, we had warning from a writer by the name of Jack Jouet, who warned us that Bannister Tarleton and his dragoons were on their way to capture us. So the legislature fled from what was Richmond to Charleston and then later to Stanton. I was in Charleston, thought I was fine and thought I was safe until Jack Jouet, riding alongside me, said, "Captain, I think we missed our turn." And when the dragoons from the British heard that, they grabbed me. And I was captured, put in jail. But having been captured so many times by the Shawnee, I just bided my time and I was released after 5 days and was able to flee the British. The one sad part about the Revolution for me was at the Battle of Blue Licks. My son, second oldest son, Israel, served alongside me. It was a quick battle. It was as a result of what happened at the Siege of Bryan Station. We were pursuing both the British and Shawnee and other tribes that had given up their siege at Bryan Station, and we wanted to capture them before they could cross the Ohio River and flee from us. When we reached the area of the Blue Licks, we had some men that wanted to charge in after them to look for the Shawnee and the British. I was hesitant, having known the territory, and was concerned about an ambush and wanted to go around the Blue Licks. But one officer by the name of, I'm sorry, I'm getting old, so I'm forgetting his last name. He was a major, yelled, "All those who are cowards can stay here, but follow me if you're not a coward." And so the men charged in, and as I suspected, there was an ambush, and the battle lasted 15 minutes. My son was beside me. He wouldn't leave my side until I had a horse that was shot out from under me. And as I grabbed another horse, I turned to look, and I saw my son Israel shot. And I knew it was a mortal wound. I had to leave him on the ground, grab my horse, grab my men who were able to flee alongside me, and we escaped. So that was a day that I've never been able to forget, that my son Israel died beside me at the Battle of Blue Licks. But I was able to save the men that served under me, most of them. And there were 71 men died within 15 minutes during that battle. I think my time is growing short. I think I've been talking for about half an hour. So there's a lot more to my story, a lot more to my travels after Kentucky, after all of the legal battles over land. Much of my family moved in 1799 to Missouri, where I was appointed as a syndic, which is a judge, also as a commandant by the Spanish, and given land and settled in Missouri in 1799. And we thought all was well until in 1803, Thomas Jefferson, the United States government, acquired from during the Louisiana Purchase, that land that was today Missouri and the other land around it. And I again lost all of my land to the American government because they wouldn't honor my Spanish claims. So there's much more to that story. I lived until 1820. My wife, Rebecca, died in 1813. We buried her in the Bryan Cemetery. I visited her grave frequently, had many grandchildren around me. In 1820, I died in my son's house, Nathan Boone, who had one hand, and my daughter Jemima was on the other side of the bed as I left this earth. So thank you for being here with me. There's a lot more to my life. I hear there's a lot been written about me. Some of it's myth, such as me wearing a coonskin cap, and some of it's truth. So enjoy reading through what you might find that's told about me. And thank you for being here to celebrate my 290th birthday.
190th birthday.